Hello again, everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about the future of neuroscience at the Weizmann Institute. We have just talked about the role of history, specifically the historical role of the European Committee in advancing science at the Weizmann Institute. Often you hear about the history and the future being compared against one another, but they are of course tightly linked, with past knowledge providing the roots for the future progress. I like to think of science as history in the making. In science, new insights can only be gained by starting with the knowledge and insight revealed in the past by our scientific predecessors, and building up from there. We merge them to the present. We look around us and reach outward to learn from the discoveries of our current colleagues, within neuroscience and outside the field altogether. And we dream about the future. Imagine what it might be and how life could have less suffering and more productivity if we could solve some of the problems that afflict humanity today. Neuroscience research is often called the last great frontier of the life and medical sciences. Because there is so much yet to be explored in how the brain and neural system function and also malfunction, so many debilitating diseases and conditions are still barely understood. So many big questions, like how we learn, perceive, move, and form memories, are not fully answered. We are still imagining a better future in so many areas related to the brain. Why is the brain the hardest nut to crack? First, because the sheer quantity of neurons and the complexity of neuronal connection is unlike any network in the human body. It's so complex that it takes 20 years to fully develop a massive proportion of an average lifespan. Second, because it's incredibly difficult to study in live human subjects, but new tools and technologies in genetics, protein studies, circuitry and connectivity and imaging are now enabling us to look at the brain in ways we could only dream of before, and conduct studies that we could only theorize about but never carry out until now. All of this leads us to where we are today. In neuroscience, we find ourselves at a very important moment, a tipping point at which accumulated knowledge can be leveraged to make a huge difference. Thanks to many developments, especially over the last 20 years, we now have a great diversity of expertise within neuroscience. There has been an explosion of knowledge, and as other scientific fields have developed, we are witnessing an outpouring of insights from labs that never set out to explore the brain, but whose discoveries have major relevance to it. Now the challenge is, getting our heads around it all. And more than that, fusing the knowledge, the metaphorical equivalent of getting everyone in the same room to talk, swap ideas, and then start speaking the same language. This is exactly why we are establishing the Institute for Brain and Neurosciences. What do I mean by speaking the same language? Science has become so sophisticated that each subfield has its own expertise, almost like its own dialect. And because studies that originate outside of neurobiology may end up being very valuable, in fact, to brain science, we need to learn from each other and harmonize our knowledge for the sake of discovering new things. Let's examine together a few examples. Dr. Rina Rosenzweig is a structural biologist who is learning a lot about how proteins work. She recently figured out the mechanism by which two protein families break apart amyloid fibers in the brain. These are toxic fibers that have been tied to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other neurodegenerative diseases. She did that work with the help of Dr. Nir London, who is an organic chemist. And then there is Professor Eran Orenstein, a molecular geneticist who is identifying genes expressed in motor neurons and neurons that control movement. His work is relevant to ALS, a debilitating neurodegenerative disease. None of these individuals are neuroscientists by training, but they are contributing to neuroscience in dramatic ways. If brought together through the Institute for Brain and Neural Sciences, Can you imagine what their research might lead to next? Let me introduce another pair. We all know that our body processes sensory information, which is something we all take for granted, as long as we remain healthy. But there are many diseases and conditions, like for instance schizophrenia, in which sensory processing goes wrong. Professor Ivo Spiegel is a neuroscientist who came from the world of molecular biology. He's discovering how the molecules and cells in our brain control its function and give us the ability to sense our environment. Professor Igor Olitsky is interested in how our DNA gives rise to RNA, which give rise to proteins. His particular expertise is a special class of RNA known as link RNAs, long non-coding RNAs. These link RNAs were once thought as part of our junk DNA. But scientists now understand they have a very important role to play in translating our genes into functions play out in the body. Igor is especially interested in how these mechanisms affect the brain. So Igor, who is at the Department of Biological Regulation, and Ivo are already collaborating. Can you imagine not having this kind of knowledge from Igor's lab brought into neuroscience? Here is another exciting example. A few months ago, Professor Ronnie Paz, who is the head of the Department of Neurobiology, identified the specific neuronal circuit responsible for eye contact as a characteristic of social skills. He also found that it is located next to the part of the brain responsible for positive and negative stimuli. That's the ancient part of the brain that helps us instinctively avoid threats or survive. The finding was evidence that eye contact and social patterns of communication evolved together with survival instincts. It's a finding that could have implications for conditions such as autism, where social function is impaired. Can you imagine bringing Ronnie together with Dr. Michal Rivlin, who is investigating the neuronal circuitry of the retina in the eye? Or with Professor Tali Kimchi, a neuroscientist who is revealing the sex differences in behavior, particularly in autism? Or with Professor Ofer Izar, whose optogenetic tools are already helping Tali and others to reveal the brain networks specific to each gender? And I could go on and on. Many of you know the Institute very well. And so you know that one of our strengths is the fact that the walls between departments and faculties are already permeable. If anyone knows how to interact informally and share ideas, it's us. It's such a good recipe for success that we have decided we need to take it to the next level. And the next level is to put interdisciplinarity on steroids. The new Institute for Brain and Neural Sciences will do exactly that. It will create the synergy within neuroscience and outside of it, both through a building whose design and layout will enable interaction, and through funding and organizational mechanisms that will encourage working across different fields toward collective goals. It will be a state-of-the-art institute that will be housed in a state-of-the-art building, and it will enable us to bring together dozens of groups across campus. This lab will include members of the Department of Neurobiology, but also many other research groups who study the brain and the nerve system across campus. This is a $200 million project. It is comprised of 11 centers on an array of research areas, from mental health to perception, to memory and learning, to neurodegenerative diseases, to brain injury, and to the tools and technologies of the future. It will include the most sophisticated equipment and infrastructure, because the outcomes of modern science are heavily depend on the most cutting-edge tools. Architectural plans for the building are currently being finalized, and we hope to be able to submit them for permitting in March, with construction set to begin within 2 years. I can promise you that it will be a stunning facility. We are looking to our friends around the world to help us raise philanthropic resources that will enable the success of this ambitious project. I also think that part of our collective task is to inspire dialogue around the brain on a public scale. You can help us on both fronts to generate what promises to be a cascade of discoveries that will help heal people and lead to a great insight about ourselves. I started out talking about history, and I will end on that note. If past is prologue, a preface to the future, I believe our European friends, who have been part of our scientific journey since the beginning, will be our partners in neuroscience discovery in the years to come. Investing in neuroscience is investing in history in the making. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting you all, our friends, in person in Zurich next year.